Good evening. Thank you for joining. On behalf of BelSECT, I would like to welcome you to this second refresher course. We would also like to thank our sponsors for making these evenings and other gatherings possible. During this refresher course, Professor Rex will take us through the topic of oxygen and carbon dioxide transports. Professor Rex is an anesthesiologist from the University Hospital of Leuven. He is specialized in the anesthesia for cardiothoracic and vascular surgery. He is also one of the teachers for the training of the perfusionists in Leuven. Therefore, we ask him to discuss the topic tonight and refresh our memory. If there are any questions during the presentation, you can write it down in the toolbar at the bottom of the page, where you can find the question and answer box. So after the presentation, I will address them to Professor Rex. So please welcome Professor Rex. You can share your screen. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to do this refresher course with you together. It's still, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating topics in physiology, the oxygen and CO2 transport. And actually, in my opinion, it's the essential for every perfusionist, because your task is to assure that every patient gets enough oxygen into his cells. So this is our core business. The same holds true for anesthesiology. I hope that you are not disappointed that in my lecture I will not address oxygen transport over oxygenator membranes. I'm just a stupid anesthesiologist, not smart enough to discuss with you the membrane physiology of oxygenators, but I think the human body is already fascinating enough to be addressed this evening. Luckily for us, the human patients are critically dependent upon oxygen. We have several concerning aspects which makes us very important as perfusionists and as anesthesiologists. So on the one hand, we have relatively high oxygen consumption even in rest. So you know that every adult consumes around 3 to 4 milliliters mLs per kilogram per minute oxygen per minute, and this equals 300 mLs per minute in a 75 kilo patient. And children, it's even higher. They have an oxygen consumption of around about 7 to 9 mLs per kilo per minute. On the other hand, our body does not have any relevant stores for oxygen. Even if we have pre-oxygenated our patient with pure oxygen, we have a maximum oxygen store of around 4 liters. That means that a human being can survive without any measure only around 10 minutes, but only under the prerequisite that he has been pre-oxygenated before apnea had occurred. This is particularly relevant for us as anesthesiologists. For example, if we want to do a rapid sequence induction, you see here a figure showing the relationship or the time span it takes to deoxygenate the patient once apnea has occurred, in dependency upon his age, upon pregnancy or not pregnancy, and upon pre-oxygenation or not. So in the best case, in the best scenario, it takes 9 minutes before the patient deoxygenates. This is the reason why pre-oxygenation in rapid sequence inductions is so important. And then you all know that is the third aspect that makes oxygen so important and so critical, is that the vital tissues, at least like the brain and also the heart, do not have a large tolerance for hypoxia. So you see that the brain that it only takes 3 minutes of apnea, of hypoxia, before the first brain cells start to disease. And you also know that the heart is not very happy with hypoxia. So all this, a limited store of oxygen, a relatively high oxygen consumption, and intolerance for hypoxia is our justification of being. So imagine a patient would have a lot of oxygen stores and all his organs would be tolerant for hypoxia. You as a perfusionist would not be necessary, because the patient could say, well, for the next 2 hours, for the next 2 weeks, I just stop breathing. Then the cardiac surgeon can do the surgery, and we don't need any ventilation or CPV. So luckily, our body is critically dependent upon oxygen, and there are no stores. The problem is that oxygen, that the journey of the oxygen does not end in the lungs for sure. So it means that the oxygen has to diffuse from the lungs into the blood, has then to be transported via the blood to the peripheral cells, where ultimately or eventually the oxygen is used in the mitochondria to produce ATP and to ensure cellular survival. You can imagine that on this traject, that there are many steps that have to be overcome, and in all these steps, things can go wrong, and this means that there is always a problem, and there's always a possibility that the patient gets hypoxic, because if somewhere on this cascade something goes wrong, the patient can get into trouble. You see that this is a normal way of doing. So we start, as we will see later on, we start with a partial pressure of oxygen of around 160 millimeters mercury, and in the mitochondria we end up between 4 and 23 millimeters mercury. That means we lose a lot of oxygen already if everything goes smoothly and if optimal conditions are prevailing. Imagine that something goes wrong, then you end up here at very low levels that may not be suited anymore for survival. So the first determinant of oxygenation is the inspired oxygen concentration and the barometric pressure. I will explain it in detail. So according to physicist Dalton, the inspiratory pressure of any gas equals the concentration of this gas, of the fraction of this gas, in the barometric pressure, so in the total pressure. And I show you here the values for oxygen. You know that the fraction of oxygen, if you breathe room air, then the fraction of oxygen is for sure 21%. And in Flanders, where we are nearly all overall at sea level, everywhere at sea level, we have a barometric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. So the inspiratory partial pressure of oxygen is 159 millimeters of mercury. You see, if you increase the inspiratory pressure of oxygen to 100%, you can increase the inspiratory pressure of oxygen correspondingly to 760 millimeters of mercury. There's one important caveat, that is that this relationship holds true for the so-called standard temperature pressure dry conditions. That means these numbers have been calculated for a temperature of 0 degrees Celsius under absolutely dry conditions. But human physiology looks different. The problem is that that is not the problem. Luckily, the air that we breathe or that we inspire is humidified in our nose. That's very important, because you all know if you don't humidify or humify the breathing mixtures, then your lungs will be destroyed, the cilia will be destroyed, and you end up in a severe lung injury. So it's very important that the nose and the nasopharynx humidifies the inspiratory gas during the passage through the respiratory tract. But this means that the oxygen that we inspire is diluted by the water vapor that originates from the nose. And if you bring this into this formula, you see that you have to diminish the barometric pressure by the water vapor pressure. And then you end up already at 149 millimeters of mercury. That means that just by your normal physiology, we have the first loss of inspiratory partial pressure of oxygen, which is very important to guarantee the survival of our lungs. But this holds also true of this comes at the expense of the first loss of oxygen. You all know this, how to increase FiO2. For you as a perfusionist, it's just very simple. You just take your oxygen button and turn it to the right, and then you are at 100%. For us anesthesiologists, this is a little bit more difficult. So a normal nose, what is it in English? And this nose tool, you have 40%. With a mask, you have 40 to 60%. If you take a mask with a reservoir, you can maximally achieve 80%. Only when ventilating the patient via a tube, you can achieve 100%. Barometric pressure is also a fact that we are not very much aware of, because we have the luxury that we work at sea level or nearly at sea level. So we don't see any major problems with barometric pressure. But you should be aware that there are situations. Imagine you would be a perfusionist in the capital city of Nepal, or if you do an ECMO transport in a plane, then you suddenly have to deal with barometric pressure. The problem is, if you take again our law of Dalton, then you see that now the barometric pressure is very important. The oxygen concentration is everywhere on the Earth the same. So it's on the top of the Himalaya, it's 21%, and in Ostend, it's also 21%. But you all know that the barometric pressure decreases with altitude. And this means, again, if you take this into account in this formula, then you see that with increasing altitude, the PaO2 decreases dramatically. Here are figures showing this again. So if you have an inspired partial pressure of oxygen, I said that we have at sea level, we have around 150. If you are at 6,000 meters of altitude, you are ending up at somewhere 70. And the same holds true for the oxygen cascade. The PO2 decreases also with increasing altitude. So you see that the cascade starts at lower levels and ends at lower levels. Here are some figures about barometric pressure relative to altitude. This is a situation in Maria Middelares or in Sint-Jan in Brugge. 0 meter altitude sea level. We have a barometric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. This results in a PO2 of 149, which is 21%. If we would do cardiac surgery at somewhere near the top of the Mount Everest, then we have only an inspired partial pressure of oxygen of around 42 millimeters of mercury. And this would correspond at Maria Middelares to an FiO2 of 6%. So people running around here, the Sherpas at 8,600 meters, actually they breathe in a fraction of oxygen of 21%, but this corresponds at sea level to 6%. What is also very interesting from an academic point of view is the altitude of 19,200 meters. This is called the Armstrong's limit. And this is very interesting because then you have a barometric pressure of 47. And if you are aware of the fact that the partial pressure of water in the blood is also 47 millimeters of mercury, then you realize that once you reach this Armstrong's limit, your blood would start to boil. And this is the reason why astronauts, for example, apart from the vacuum, have to wear this spacesuit, because otherwise their blood would just begin to boil. So anyway, it's a very fascinating area, this altitude medicine. And normally we do not get into contact with this, but I mean, for you and for us, it could be of relevance if, for example, you would do an ECMO transport in a plane at a certain altitude. Be aware that the planes are using a pressure cabin, but these pressure cabins are not producing a pressure of sea level. They are producing a pressure of around 2,000 meters of altitude. So also there you have already a significant decrease in the PiO2. This is a very fascinating study illustrating this relationship between altitude and oxygenation. Some crazy physiologists or pulmonologists, I don't know how they got their blood gas machine to hear the so-called balcony at the Mount Everest, 8,400 meters of altitude. And then there were obviously 4 climbers passing by, and they took an arterial blood gas from these climbers. So I hope they had an informed consent. Very crazy. I love it. I love it. I know a perfusionist from Leuven who would immediately be part of this investigators team. But you see, it's crazy. The PaO2 of these climbers was at these 8,400 meters of altitude. The PaO2 was between 20 and 30, and the saturation was here in one of these subjects 34.4. And they were not there lying in the sun and relaxing. They were on their way to climb 400 meters of altitude more. So very, very interesting what the human body can tolerate. So that was the first step of the oxygen cascade. So inspired oxygen concentration and the barometric pressure. Then the oxygen gets into the alveoli, and there also strange things happen. You all know that in the alveoli, there's no vacuum. They are filled with gas, and they are filled predominantly with CO2, for sure, because CO2 comes from the organs and from the tissues to the lungs to get exhaled. So the oxygen meets the CO2 in the alveoli. But this means that the oxygen that gets into the alveoli is diluted by the CO2. And then with a complex formula, you can calculate the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. Cannot be measured directly. Obviously, it cannot be measured directly. So you have to calculate it. You have to take the respiratory quotient into account. And you see that you lose only by the dilution with CO2, you lose the next 35 to 40 millimeters of mercury oxygen, and you end up with an FiO2 of a concentration of oxygen in the alveoli of 14%. So you lose a lot just by dilution of with the CO2. This is another approach how you can calculate the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. The dilution of oxygen by CO2 is also very interesting because this can explain why patients that are hypoventilating, for example, a patient with an opioid intoxication has also hypoxia, because normally, imagine you have a heroin intoxication or a iatrogenic intoxication with opioids. The resident of anesthesiology extubated the patient too early, and he had was still on too much opioids. So the patient starts to hypoventilate, even with 100% oxygen, he will become hypoxic. Why? Because due to the hypoventilation, a lot of CO2 accumulates in the alveoli, and this dilutes the incoming oxygen more. That means it causes hypoxia. On the other hand, what people are doing in high altitudes is that they start to hyperventilate in a compensatory response, just to get rid of the CO2 in the alveoli and to have less dilution of the oxygen. And now we come back to our mountaineers. Very interesting. Look now at the PaCO2s of these guys there at the camp, at the balcony camp. They had CO2s between 10 and 15. So very, very low CO2s, just in a desperate manner to get rid of the oxygen, of the CO2 in the alveoli to have less dilution. So very, very fascinating in my opinion. Okay, the same holds true if you have a high peripheral oxygen consumption. Then you produce obviously a lot of CO2. That means patients with a hypermetabolism, with a high CO2 in the alveoli, will also have lower PaO2s, because you have, if you have more metabolism, you have more CO2, and then you have more dilution of your oxygen. The next step is then the diffusion of oxygen. So you have here fascinating images from an electron microscope. You see here the lumen of one alveolus, and here the lumen of another alveolus. And these two alveoli are separated by a very thin membrane, and within, you see here the histology of this image. You see here the alveolus, the lumen of the alveolus. You see here the alveolar epithelium. Then you have a short interstitium. Then you have the capillary endothelium. Then you have here some erythrocytes that are compressed here through the small capillary, and then you have the same here again, endothelium, interstitial space, and epithelium of the alveoli. And all the structure is designed to make the distance between the gas in the alveoli and the erythrocytes as small as possible. And you can, this is, the diffusion is also very easy to grasp if you take this law of mathematical description of diffusion into account. This is a law of Fick, the same Fick that developed the formula to calculate cardiac output. But here it's a diffusion law. And you see that the diffusion here described as a transport of any material. So delta n over, so delta n is the transport of particles or of gas or whatever. So delta n over delta t equals the diffusion coefficient times the diffusion area times the concentration gradient and divided by the wall thickness. So very easy and very intuitively to grasp. For sure, you have more diffusion if you have a high diffusion gradient or pressure gradient between alveolar partial pressure of oxygen and capillary partial pressure of oxygen. That's very obvious. And you have a high diffusion if you have a lot of area available for a diffusion, and the diffusion is optimal if the wall thickness is as small as possible. Very logical. And this also explains why a lot of pulmonary diseases or cardiopulmonary diseases result in diffusion problems and eventually in hypoxia. If you have, for example, emphysema, then your alveoli are just destroyed and you have less diffusion area available. That means you end up with hypoxia. If you have either edema or fibrosis, your wall thickness will increase and the diffusion will also decrease. And if you have hypoxia, you have less gradient, a diffusion gradient or concentration gradient over your membrane here, and you will have hypoxia at the end. And vice versa, or the other way around, if you increase alveolar partial pressure of oxygen, then you will improve diffusion and you will treat hypoxia. Everything in this alveolo-capillary barrier is optimized to make this barrier as small as possible. So it would be, for example, that is a very theoretical concern, but it would for sure be a catastrophe. Imagine that oxygen would be here in the center of the alveolus, and nitrogen and CO2 at the periphery of this alveolus. But luckily, the gases within the alveolus are uniformly distributed, so this is no barrier. The alveolar lining fluid is very thin. The tissue barrier, the epithelium and the interstitial space and the endothelium are very small. The plasma layer is negligible, and the diffusion into and within the red blood cells is also very optimized. So everything is optimized to achieve the maximum diffusion. These are now the values that are important to understand the diffusion, the law of diffusion, the law by Fick. So here on the left side, we have the pulmonary artery. Here we have the pulmonary capillary, and this is the venous side of the lung capillary. And you see, so the diffusion distance, which is important for the law of Fick, is very small. It's 1 to 2 micrometers only. And then we have the pressure gradients. For oxygen, you all know that oxygen enters the pulmonary artery with around 40 millimeters of mercury, and it in the pulmonary veins, the PaO2 is around 100. So we have and in the alveolus, I told you already to you, we have also 100 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen. So we have a pressure gradient of 60 for oxygen. For CO2, the pressure gradient is much smaller. You come at the venous side of, at the arterial side of the lung capillary, we have 46 millimeters mercury partial pressure of CO2. At the venous side, we have 40, and in the alveoli, we have also 40. So the gradient is only 6 millimeters of mercury. But this is not a problem because luckily the diffusion coefficient for a CO2 is 23 times larger than for oxygen. So our body can afford to have a very low pressure gradient for CO2 because the diffusion coefficient is so good for CO2. This is, by the way, also the reason why the abdominal surgeons, for example, use CO2 as a gas to inflate the abdomen and not air, because CO2 is easily dissolved into blood and can never lead to, or hardly ever lead to, serious emboli. The same holds true for the strategy of the cardiac surgeons to flood the surgical field with CO2. And then we have the contact time. For sure, the erythrocyte needs some time to pass the alveolus and to release CO2 and to take up oxygen. But you see here that the contact time is around 0.75 seconds, but this is a very luxurious situation because after already 0.3 to 0.4 seconds, the transport is complete, finished. So that means that we can increase cardiac output up to certain levels without endangering the contact times. Only if you have very, very, very high cardiac outputs, but I cannot tell you any threshold value, then the contact time becomes a problem. This is then exactly the reason why pulmonary edema leads to hypoxia. On the left side, you see here a cardiogenic pulmonary edema, where in the beginning you have an accumulation of interstitial water, and later on you have also edema within the alveoli, and just a very simple pathomechanism that the diffusion distance becomes far too large for oxygen, so there is no gas exchange anymore. The same holds true also for the pathogenesis of pathophysiology of COVID-19. Also here you see an inflammatory pulmonary edema where the inflammatory mediators, just destroy the pulmonary vascular endothelium so that water can leave the capillaries, or plasma can leave the capillaries and get into the alveoli. And in the end, it's the same pathomechanism, that the diffusion distance just becomes too large. You can also calculate diffusion capacity by taking all these factors into account. I have never understood this. For this, you have to become a pneumologist. Then we have the next step. We have achieved, or the diffusion has taken place. And normally, I have told you now that diffusion is really optimized in a normal patient without any major lung or cardiac disease. So one would expect that the arterial oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood equals the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. But this is not true. Unfortunately, there is an alveolar arterial PO2 difference of about 15 to 35 millimeters of mercury, interestingly, depending upon age. So there's a rule of thumb that the the arterial pressure of oxygen is around 102 minus 0.33 times the age. So in young people, you will have a PaO2 of around 90 to 100, and older patients you are lower. How can we explain this difference? How can we explain that although diffusion is optimal, that there is a difference between arterial and blood, between the oxygen content in the arterial blood and in the alveoli? This has to do with two factors. First, with a scatter of VQ ratios, and second, with venous admixture. So in the ideal world, we have a 5 liter of ventilation in the lungs, VA, and 5 liter of perfusion in the lungs. So we have a VAQ relationship of 1. Then we would have no problems. But in the extremes, we also have lung areas that are ventilated but not perfused, the dead space. And we have lung areas that are not ventilated but perfused. They cause a shunt. And you all know these lung zones of West. The problem is in a supine patient, and even more in a standing patient, in a patient being upright, you have the gravitational forces that come into action. That means that in the tops of the lungs, you have less pressure. So you have, and in the tops of the lungs, these are the lung tops, this is the bottom of the lung, and both the air and the blood follow the gravitation. That means you will have more air in the at the bottom of the lung than in the top of the lung, and you will have more blood in the bottom of the lung and than in the top of the lung. The only problem is that the blood is for sure has a higher weight, so blood is more sensitive for changes in gravitational forces than ventilation. That means from the apex to the base of the lung, the perfusion increases much more than ventilation. And this results, depending upon the position of the lung, in a VAQ scatter. So again, the two extremes, that would be the apex of the lung, so nearly no perfusion, a little bit of ventilation, but in the apex of the lung, you would have a little bit of ventilation, but no perfusion because the blood accumulates at the base of the lung. This would be the normal situation, and it would be the base of the lung where you have a lot of blood and very less ventilation, so shunt. So this is a VAQ scatter. In the lungs, there are indeed, that was the situation in the healthy lung, but we also have sick lungs, sick patients, where you have not only normal alveolar ventilation and perfusion, but you also have a lot of different phenomenons. You have for example, in an atelectasis, you have non-ventilated alveoli. You have alveoli where there is a diffusion barrier, for example, due to fibrosis or edema. This causes alveolar shunt because deoxygenated blood passes these non-ventilated or or areas where no gas exchange takes place due to a diffusion barrier. They pass these long regions, long areas, and so that all the deoxygenated blood gets into the arterial blood, so right-left shunting. And then we also have extra alveolar shunts, so I will describe this later. And then we have also lung areas where we have absent blood flow, where there's dead space. So a lot of different pathomechanisms existing next to each other. Again, this holds also true in COVID-19, where you have different phenomenons next to each other. You all know that COVID-19 is associated with a high degree of intravascular thrombosis, also in the pulmonary microcirculation. So where you have no blood flow due to the thrombosis, that means you have dead space ventilation. On the other hand, you have for sure edema, which I described earlier, so a lot of diffusion problems. And in the later stages, as in every ARDS, you will have lung fibrosis, which also causes a diffusion barrier. And then the venous admixture is also very important. So I already described the right to left shunting. We have, if we take right to left shunting into account, we have two types of shunts. We have an anatomical shunt, the extrapulmonary, which is extrapulmonary, which has nothing to do with the lungs. And in these, for these anatomical shunts, we have two types. We have a physiological anatomical shunt in every human being present, caused by, for example, the Tebesian veins. These are coronary veins that do not connect to the coronary sinus, but that perforate the endocard and that get access directly to the left ventricle, to the the lumen of the left ventricle. So this is just a shortcut. These Tebesian veins think that, or are too lazy to get to the coronary sinus, that I'm so close to the lumen of the left ventricle, I just perforate the left ventricle and drain my blood directly into the left ventricle. And then we have the bronchial veins. They are also very important because for you as a perfusionist, because the bronchi are perfused by intercostal arteries, and but the veins are then are not draining to the vena cava. They just follow the pulmonary veins and ultimately drain their blood into the pulmonary veins. And this is, for example, these stupid bronchial veins are the reason why the cardiac surgeon has to place a stent, because normally this is very difficult for a beginner in anesthesiology. In the beginning of my time as an anesthetist, I had always difficulties to understand why the fucking hell the left ventricle has to be vented if we are on full bypass, because then you think, how can it be that blood that cannot enter the pulmonary circulation gets into the left ventricle? But the bronchial veins are the solution for this secret, because you as a perfusionist are perfusing the intercostal arteries, even if there's a cross clamp on the aorta. So the blood that goes into the bronchial arteries ultimately occurs in the pulmonary veins and gets into the left ventricle. And this is 1% of the cardiac output. That means we are talking about 50 cc per minute. Yeah, you see after 2 minutes or 3 minutes of an unvented left heart, your left ventricle will be severely dilated. And then you have pathological anatomical shunts. This is, for example, in congenital heart disease with right to left shunt, imagine a patient with a VSD or an ASD, and the intrapulmonary shunts we have discussed. You can calculate the shunt. It's a very complex formula, which every anesthetist and intensivist has to learn by heart for his exam. And 2 minutes later, he has forgotten this formula. Basically, it's very simple because it assumes that the total flow equals the flow via the capillaries and via the shunt. And then it's just mass preservation. The oxygen content comes into action, and then you can, by measuring the oxygen content in the different vessels, in the artery, in the pulmonary artery, and in the lung capillaries, then you can calculate the shunt fraction. For how can we measure the capillary oxygen content in the lung? This is done with a pulmonary artery catheter. You inflate the balloon of the pulmonary artery catheter, and then you take a blood gas, and this is set to correspond with the capillary oxygen content. So this is a formula how to calculate the shunt. The venous admixture is again very interesting and explains why you as a perfusionist are very, very important for a patient with ARDS. That's very obvious. If you have a venous admixture, your arterial oxygen content will decrease. And if you look then at the relationship between PaO2 and oxygen content, you see that only even very small decreases or changes of arterial oxygen content. Imagine here from, let's say, 20 to 18, you see that there's a huge drop in PaO2 because this is this strange shape of this curve. For CO2, it looks quite different because the curve is less steep. That means even if you have a big increase in CaO2, this only has minor effects on PaCO2. But this relationship is very, very important to understand why with an increasing shunt fraction, additional oxygen will not help to save your patient. You see here the famous iso-shunt diagram of none. You see here, this is a normal PaO2 of around 100 millimeters of mercury. If you have, excuse me, my computer is crazy. So if you have, for example, a shunt fraction of 10%, then you need already, wait, where's the curve? You need already 30% of oxygen to achieve the same PaO2 as if you were healthy. If you have a shunt of 20%, you already need 57% of FiO2 to restore normal PaO2. And if you have a shunt of 30%, you need an FiO2 of nearly 100%. And already as a shunt of 40%, a normal PaO2 cannot be restored. And this is the reason why, for example, a patient with this ARDS, with these huge atelectasis and consolidation areas, he cannot be saved by an FiO2 of 100%. I mean, because the shunt fraction in this patient will be certainly around 50 to 60%. So even if the anesthetist ventilates, or the intensivist ventilates a patient with 100%, he is in severe hypoxia. And then the next measure you have to take as an intensivist or anesthesiologist is to increase the ventilated areas by using, for example, PEEP or proning the patient. But if all these measures do not help, then you with the ECMO come into action. But this is the basis for this. So this is a relationship between CaO2 and PO2. And if the shunt fraction is, if the venous admixture is higher than 30%, you cannot save the patient anymore with 100% oxygen. Now we come into the blood. So the oxygen transport into blood. This is again a very important phenomenon. As you all know, blood is transported in the lung in two ways, either physically dissolved You can describe this mathematically by the law of Henry, I don't know whether this was an American or not. And this describes that the concentration of any gas in a fluid is equals the solubility coefficient and the partial pressure of this gas. The problem with oxygen is that it is nearly not soluble in blood. That means you only have 0.3 mLs oxygen per 100 milliliters oxygen dissolved in blood. So if I remember you that you consume 300 mLs of oxygen per minute, then you would need a lot of blood to transport this oxygen to the patient. So luckily, we are not dependent upon physically dissolved blood. We would not survive. Luckily, we have hemoglobin in our blood, which has a high affinity to oxygen and which helps us to transport the oxygen. Very important is that hemoglobin consists of 4 subunits, and these 4 subunits are different proteins. And according to the distribution of these proteins, HbA1 or HbA2, you have different types of hemoglobin. The core of the hemoglobin molecule is a heme group, which consists of a porphyrin ring with an iron atom. What is also important, if you have the nude hemoglobin to which no oxygen has already been bound, then the uptake of the first oxygen molecule takes a long time because this time constant is very large. But once the first molecule of oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin, then the uptake of oxygen is accelerated, and you end up in this sigmoidally shaped hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve. This dissociation curve is also very fascinating because it helps us a lot in our daily physiology. Because if you are looking here at the arterial side of this curve, you see that decreases in PaO2 are tolerated over a relatively wide range. Imagine you start here at 110 millimeters of quick of oxygen, and you decrease up to nearly 70. The saturation does not drop dramatically. On the other end, if you are in the venous side of this, at the venous part of this dissociation curve, hemoglobin has a very low affinity for oxygen. That means that oxygen delivery is facilitated at low PaO2s. That means in the peripheral tissues, oxygen release is facilitated. We can describe the position of this hemoglobin dissociation curve with the so-called P50. That is the half saturation pressure. That is the PaO2 that achieves arterial oxygen saturation of 50%. And in normal patients, it's around 27 millimeters of mercury. If we have a right shift of this curve, the P50 is higher than 27 millimeters of mercury. That means you need more partial pressure of oxygen to achieve a hemoglobin saturation of 50%. And this has certain advantages because it means that there's less affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen and that you have a facilitated oxygen release to the periphery. If you have a left shift, the half saturation pressure is lower than 27 millimeters of mercury, and you have a higher affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen and an impaired oxygen release into the periphery. If you have a careful look at your blood gas results, the modern blood gas machines give you these values. I have never seen an anesthetist or perfusionist looking at these values, but perhaps tomorrow you have a look and remember me. We can, the position of this hemoglobin dissociation curve can be or is dependent upon four factors: upon the pH, the CO2 pressure, the temperature, and the 2.3 diphosphoglycerate levels within the erythrocytes. So if you decrease pH and if you increase CO2 temperature and DPG, then you have a right shift, and you have a left shift if you increase the pH, if you decrease CO2, if you decrease temperature, and if you decrease the diphosphoglycerate. Please be aware that this is a very easy manner for you and for me to improve oxygen delivery into the peripheral tissues. So I like to have my patients a little bit acidotic. I never want to see my patient with a pH of 7.45. A pH of 7.3, I don't care about. I like it because I know that then the oxygen release into the tissues is improved. The same holds true for CO2. Hypocapnia is anyway very dangerous also for the brain, but also for the oxygen delivery into the periphery. So this is this famous 2.3 diphosphoglycerate, DPG. This, you all know that the erythrocytes do not have mitochondria. Sorry, my computer is crazy. So the erythrocytes do not have mitochondria. That means they are dependent upon anaerobic glycolysis. And normally there is this is a side way of this glycolysis, the so-called Rappaport-Lübering shunt, where 2.3 DPG is produced. Normally, this 2.3 DPG exerts a negative feedback inhibition on this enzyme and says, stop producing me. But in red cells, this 2.3 DPG is sequestered by deoxygenated hemoglobin, so there's no feedback inhibition. This is in normal red cells of only marginal significance, but if you have patients with chronic anemia or patients living at high altitude, then there is an increase in this 2.3 DPG because there is more deoxyhemoglobin, so the DPG is even better sequestered and cannot exert any negative feedback inhibition anymore. The problem with this DPG, we can hardly influence it. The only problem is if we give a lot of transfusions, you know that the packet cells have to be cooled. So, and cooling means that the glycolysis is inhibited. That means that the DPG production is decreased and that you have a left shift of hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curves. That means patients with a massive transfusion, they are usually in shock and then they get blood with a left shift of this dissociation curve. So this is really a pity. Then there's a famous Bohr effect describing this relationship. So this Bohr effect clearly says that the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen is inversely related to acidity and CO2 concentration. So this is, again, a very elegant mechanism in our body because in the lungs, we have a high pH and a low CO2. So there's a high affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. The oxygen uptake is facilitated. And in the peripheral tissues, it's exactly the way around. By the way, I have read several weeks ago that this Bohr, the physiologist, was the father of the famous nuclear physicist describing the atom model with the different, how's this in English, the different orbits of the electrons around the atoms. Then we have different hemoglobins. They have different dissociation curves. So the fetal hemoglobin also shows a clear leftward shift. This serves a very important purpose because in the placenta, there's a very, very low PO2 of around only 22 to 30 millimeters of mercury. So this facilitates the oxygen uptake. Myoglobin is a little oxygen store, but due to the high affinity to oxygen, it releases oxygen only at exercise when PO2s become very low. And very dangerous is carboxyhemoglobin because it has an extremely high affinity for carbon monoxide. So oxygen is dissociates from hemoglobin and is substituted by carboxyl. This is also conceptually very important. So we have this SpO2, that is a peripheral oxygen saturation. This is a concentration of oxygenated hemoglobin divided by the oxygenated hemoglobin and the deoxygenated hemoglobin. It can be measured with conventional pulse oximeters, and you have a peripheral oxygen saturation of 98 to 100%. But this is not the whole truth, because in your blood you have also other hemoglobins than oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin. You also have methemoglobin, you have CO hemoglobin, and sulf hemoglobin. And so you can measure this only with a multi-wave oximeter in a classical blood gas machine, or with the Massimo pulse oximeter, which also employs different wavelengths. Now it becomes very interesting for you as perfusionists, because we can now calculate the oxygen content in our blood. Therefore, we need the so-called Hüfner's constant. That is very easily to derive. So we know that 1 mole of hemoglobin binds 4 moles of oxygen. We know that 1 mole oxygen equals around 22.4 liters. And we know that 1 mole of hemoglobin is then 22.4 times 4 makes 89.6 liter oxygen. We also know that 1 mole of hemoglobin weighs 64.5 kilograms. And then we can just divide 89.6 or 89,600 milliliters by 64,500 grams. And then we end up either at 1.31 or 1.39 milliliters oxygen. So 1 gram hemoglobin binds this amount of oxygen. There are some differences in the different textbooks, because there's never a situation in the body where all hemoglobin molecules all bind 4 oxygen molecules, because this is not possible. And then we can calculate the oxygen constant. We have the dissolved oxygen, and we have the chemically bound oxygen with the corresponding units. I don't want to bore you, but we end up then with 0.3 milliliters per deciliter dissolved oxygen, and around 19.3 milliliters per deciliter chemically bound oxygen, in total 20 milliliters per deciliter. On the venous side, mixed venous, we have the same, but we have 15 milliliters of deciliter. That means that the arterial venous oxygen difference is only 5 milliliters per deciliter. That means that we have really a luxury situation, because the body takes only 5 milliliters of these 20 milliliters, so we have only an extraction rate of 25%. The oxygen content is mainly dependent upon the hemoglobin. This is very easy if you remember this formula, and this is exactly the reason why cyclists do a high altitude training, or why they inject erythropoietin, because by only increasing the hemoglobin, let's say by 0.5 gram per deciliter, you can calculate it at home. If you want, you achieve a huge amount of more oxygen content. These are some important terms we all have to be familiar with. So hypoxia is a situation if the arterial oxygen, if the partial pressure of arterial oxygen is too low. We have hypoxygenation if the oxygen saturation is too low, and we have hypoxemia if the oxygen content is too low. And we have ischemia that has nothing to do with oxygen content, it's only that there is absence of blood flow. And then we have hypoxemia, so it's a decrease in oxygen content. And then we have several forms of hypoxemia. And I don't want to bore you with these terms, but it's very important because it's very relevant for our clinical practice. So we have hypoxic hypoxemia if the PaO2 or the oxygen saturation is low, and we have anemic hypoxemia if just the if the hemoglobin concentration is too low. So you can have a severe hypoxemia even if your PaO2 and your SaO2 is perfect, but if your hemoglobin is too low. The classical example for this are the Jehovah's Witnesses with an hemoglobin of 2, for example. They have a PaO2 of 300, but still they have a myocardial infarction due to hypoxemia. And then you have also toxic hypoxemia if you have a normal PaO2 and SaO2, if you have a normal hemoglobin value, but if your hemoglobin molecules are not working properly, for example, if they are bound to CO or to if there's methemoglobin. And what's very important is that the tolerance of our body towards these different hypoxemias is very different. So the best tolerated hypoxemia is anemic hypoxemia, because you have this increase in this 2,3 DPG. The hypoxic hypoxemia somewhere in between, and the least tolerated is a toxic hypoxemia, because there you have a left shift of the hemoglobin dissociation curve. Then we can calculate the oxygen delivery, because you don't, there's no use in a lot of oxygen content if the oxygen content is not transported by the blood to the periphery. So you just multiply your oxygen content with the cardiac output, and then there's a factor 10 to come to this unit. And then you have an oxygen delivery of 1 liter per minute, and then a cardiac output, and the same holds true for the VO2. You have an oxygen, the VO2, so the oxygen consumption is 250 milliliters per minute. Again, the oxygen extraction rate is then only 25%. This is very important. So in a normal situation, the body only extracts 25% of the oxygen. And this means that there's a lot of reserve. So if the periphery is in trouble, it just can increase oxygen extraction, because there's still 75% to extract. And this you can see, this you can measure very easily by monitoring the oxygen saturation in your venous blood, in the oxygen in your cardiopulmonary bypass. Because you see, if the body starts to increase oxygen concentration, extraction, then you will have a decrease in the central or in the mixed venous oxygen saturation. So normally, the arterial blood has a saturation of 100%. You have an extraction of 25%, so you see a venous oxygen saturation of 75%. But if you increase oxygen extraction, let's say to 50%, then the venous oxygen saturation is also 50%. And this is an alarm sign for you as a perfusionist, or for me as an anesthesiologist. There says that there's something wrong with oxygen delivery. The last step is then in the peripheral tissues, that the oxygen has again to leave the blood and get into the to the cells. And but this is again diffusion. So you remember the law of Fick. So you need a lot of exchange area, and luckily our body has an incredible large exchange area here of 1,000 square meters. Imagine you could rent this in the center of Leuven. You would be very rich. And the diffusion distance is also rather small, 10 to 25 micrometers. And the driving force is then the pressure gradient of oxygen between the oxygen and in the capillaries and in the cells. If you want, I can send you my presentation as a PDF, then you have all these values at hand if you are boring yourself after your CPB. So what can we do now to improve DO2? And it's very frustrating because we cannot do so much. On the tracheal level, we can increase, for example, FeIO2. But I showed you that there are several examples in pathology where the increase in FeIO2 is not sufficient to help the patient. For sure, as anesthetists, we have to take care that the airway patency is maintained. We have to assure that the alveoli are open. That's why we use CPAP or ventilate the patient. And we can optimize DO2. I showed you several ways how to do it, and you are very important in optimizing DO2 because you have a very easy way to increase cardiac output by just turning your machine to the right. And the microcirculation is can still not be reached by any measure. So some people have dreamed that by administering vasodilators we could improve microcirculation, but this is not true. And also mitochondria, it would be a dream to affect mitochondria with any therapy, but it's still not available. This is also a very, 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 very good figure that I like very much. It's already 16 years old. There you can see which factors by which we can influence oxygen delivery are most important. So you see, this is the baseline. You have here a patient, a critically ill patient with an FiO2 of 21%. He has an arterial oxygen saturation of 75, so he's in trouble. He has only a hemoglobin of 7 and a cardiac output of 4. So the first step would be to increase FiO2. So you increase DO2 by 22%. And then, so this is a huge increase, but then nearly the doubling of FiO2 doesn't help the patient much more, because then the incremental increase in DO2 is only 9%. So FiO2 is, I told you, with this venous admixture, it helps, but it is never the solution to all problems. Then the intensivist added or gave the administered packet cell, so increased the hemoglobin from 7 to 10.5. And I already told you and showed you that the hemoglobin is a very, very important determinant of arterial oxygen content. So he increased by doing a blood transfusion, the DO2 was increased by 50% with respect to this. And then cardiac output was increased by 50%, and you see that oxygen, the oxygen delivery was also increased by 50%. So this highlights the importance of the perfusionist, because just turning the button to the right, you can help the patient a lot. And this is also, by the way, the basis for all your goal-directed perfusion concepts, increasing oxygen delivery. This is just this stupid little image explaining why you are turning the button to the right. In the following 5 minutes, I hope that I still have these 5 minutes. I will tell you a little bit about CO2 transport. It's very fast, but it's also very fascinating. So CO2 is also transported physically dissolved, but only 10%. As for hemoglobin, the chemical binding of CO2 is much more important. So there are two important reactions resulting in CO2 transport. The first is that CO2 is that bicarbonate is formed. You know this famous enzyme carboanhydrase, so it produces bicarbonate, and then CO2 is also bound to amino groups of the hemoglobin molecule. You see here the steps. So in the tissue, you have, due to the metabolism, you have CO2. CO2 is then taken up by the erythrocyte. So the erythrocyte is really, really a very important cell in our body. And then the CO2 undergoes a transformation to bicarbonate by the carbonic anhydrase. And in these reactions, a proton is formed. And then the bicarbonate ion leaves the erythrocytes to the plasma by the so-called Hamburger shift. On the other hand, CO2 is also taken up by the erythrocyte and is then bound to the hemoglobin molecule. And again, one proton is formed. And now we have a very elegant trick of the body, because hemoglobin is a very, very important buffer for protons. So that means that in these reactions, there will never be an equilibrium, because all these protons are buffered away. So if you remove the protons from these reactions, then the reaction will go on endlessly. So that means that large quantities of CO2 can be incorporated in bicarbonate and hemoglobin carbamate. The same is then the other way around. Once the erythrocyte reaches the lungs, the CO2 concentration decreases, and then the reactions turn around. Here again, another figure. So we have 10% physically solved CO2, 10% is bind to the hemoglobin, and 80% is formed to bicarbonate. And then there's another very, very important trick. So hemoglobin is a very good buffer, but deoxygenated hemoglobin is even a better buffer. That means that deoxygenated hemoglobin can take up much more protons than oxygenated hemoglobin. And that means that if you have, if you are in the periphery where there is a lot of CO2, there's also a lot of deoxygenated hemoglobin because the hemoglobin molecule has already released the oxygen. So there's a lot of deoxygenated hemoglobin. This facilitates the CO2 uptake in the periphery. So low oxygen, high CO2 uptakes. This is the Haldane effect. And that means that the affinity of hemoglobin to CO2 is inversely related to the oxygen concentration. And again, in the lungs, high oxygen concentration, low affinity for CO2, so CO2 is released more easily, and the other way around in the peripheral tissues. And this you can, then there's also a CO2 dissociation curve. This is also, looks a little bit like the hemoglobin, but it does not have the sigmoidal shape. Again, the physical dissolved CO2, that is not much amount, but still 10 times more than oxygen. And then you have the red curve. This is this is at an oxygen saturation of 100%, and the purple curve at an oxygen saturation of 0%, hypothetical conditions. And the Haldane effect explains the shift of these two curves in dependency upon the oxygen concentration. If you want to read more about this, then I recommend you these books, and a lot of my figures are taken from these books. And now I hope that you liked this refresher course, and that I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, Professor, thank you very much for your very nice presentation. I'm sure that it was a really good refresher on the topic. We have a question from the audience, so I will ask them to you. In some recovering VV ECMO patients, we find the carbon dioxide diffusion is problematic, like it is recovering later on, while the patient is normoxic. Could you explain why one can have a carbon dioxide diffusion problem without an oxygen diffusion problem, as in ACOR, for example?
To be honest, I don't have any idea. I don't know, but I think is this for patients still on ECMO?
What they have like normoxic. I think some recovering.
Yeah, because I don't, as I already told in the beginning, I'm not an expert in membranes of oxygenators. I don't know how these diffusion works on these oxygenators. Perhaps there is a problem. I don't know. In patients, it's very, is somebody proposing that there is an alveolar dead space ventilation? Can be. Interesting question, but I don't have any convincing answer at hand now.
Okay. You told the oxygen consumption is about 300 milliliters per minute for 75 kilogram patients.
Yeah.
When you have a big patient of 110 kilograms, do you believe in lean body mass? And for us as perfusionists, because we think we have a lot of fat that we don't have to oxygenate, or isn't that very big?
Yeah, I completely agree. If you have a 120 kilogram American footballer, I would say that these 120 kilograms need oxygen, but if you have a 120 kilogram couch potato, then I would go for the lean body mass. That's true. But I'm not aware of studies measuring this for perfusion. But instinctively, I would completely agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Why do we put COVID patients on prone ventilation before we?
This has to do with ventilation perfusion mismatch. You know that this is not only for COVID patients, this is for every ARDS patient. You know that you have a ventilation perfusion mismatch because if you are in the supine position, then the air will preferentially go to the upper parts of the lungs, so that are more to the heart, let's say like this, whereas the perfusion will preferentially go to the lower parts of the lungs, close to the diaphragm. And then you have a huge ventilation perfusion mismatch. You have atelectasis at the dependent parts of the lungs. And by proning the patient, you will, first of all, you will improve ventilation of these dependent lung areas, and you will redirect perfusion to the ventilated areas. So this is a trick of proning, and it works very good, very well.
Okay, I think we have the questions. We want to thank everyone to being back at this webinar. We invite you to the next refresher course that will take place on June 23 with the topic of malignant hyperthermia. Also, we want to make you excited about the symposium of the BelSECT that will take place on the 26th and 27th November in Brussels. Hopefully, we will see each other in live instead of these webinars. You will receive more information shortly, or the information can be found soon on the BelSECT website. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Rex for this evening, and I wish everyone a good evening and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.